The bullet had torn through Frank Yates's forearm, just as the sun began its descent behind the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting Petaluma, California in shades of crimson that matched the blood soaking through his shirt sleeve. He stumbled through the dusty streets of the small town in the spring of 1878, cursing his luck and the card cheat who had pulled iron faster than Frank could blink. His vision blurred as he pushed past startled townsfolk, desperate to find help before he collapsed in the middle of Main Street like some greenhorn fresh off the wagon train. The modest house at the edge of town appeared through his haze of pain like a mirage in the desert. White clapboard siding, a small porch with a rocking chair, and a sign that read Hannah Langford, seamstress and mending, swinging gently in the evening breeze. Frank didn't care if she could sew a dress or patch a quilt. He needed someone, anyone, to help him before he bled out. He stumbled up the porch steps and pounded on the door with his good hand. The woman who answered was younger than he expected, maybe 23 or 24, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes the color of winter grass. Those eyes widened at the sight of him, but she didn't scream or slam the door in his face like he half expected. Instead, Hannah Langford's gaze moved from his ashen face to his bloody arm, and something shifted in her expression, a kind of resolve that surprised him. "Inside," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. "Before you bleed all over my porch and give Mrs. Henderson next door something to gossip about for the next month." Frank didn't argue. He let her guide him through the small parlor, past a sewing machine and bolts of fabric, into a kitchen that smelled of bread and lavender. She pulled out a chair from the simple wooden table and practically pushed him into it. "Take off your shirt," Hannah ordered, already moving to pump water into a basin. "Madam, I don't think that's proper," Frank managed, though the words came out weak. She turned to face him, and for the first time he noticed the absence of a wedding ring on her finger. "I've got 3 younger brothers and a father who worked cattle before he passed. I've seen plenty of blood and patched up more wounds than I care to count. Your modesty is not worth your life. Now take off that shirt before you die in my kitchen, and I have to explain to Sheriff Morrison why there's a dead cowboy at my table." Frank complied, fumbling with the buttons until she huffed impatiently and helped him, her fingers quick and efficient. When she peeled away the blood-soaked fabric, they both got a clear look at the wound. The bullet had passed clean through the meat of his forearm, missing the bone but leaving a nasty tear on both sides. "You're lucky," Hannah said, bringing the basin of water to the table along with clean cloths. "Whoever shot you wasn't a very good aim, or you moved at just the right moment. Feel real lucky right now," Frank said through gritted teeth as she began cleaning the wound. The pain was sharp and immediate, but her hands were gentle, careful not to cause more damage than necessary. "What happened?" she asked, focused on her work. Frank hesitated. He didn't know this woman, didn't know if she'd run him out of town once she learned the truth. But there was something about the way she tended his wound, the calm competence in her movements that made him want to be honest. "Card game went south. Man pulled a gun when I called him out for cheating. I'm not a gambling man by nature, madam. I was just passing through, needed enough money for supplies before heading north to find work on one of the ranches up in Sonoma County." Hannah's hands paused for just a moment, then continued their careful work. "Did you kill him?" "No, madam. Got my shot off first, hit his hand. He dropped the gun and I ran. Didn't figure sticking around to see if he had friends was the smartest play." "Smart thinking," she said, surprising him again. She reached for a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet, and Frank's hopes rose until she poured it directly onto the wound instead of offering him a drink. He hissed through his teeth, his good hand gripping the edge of the table hard enough to make the wood creak. "Sorry," Hannah said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sorry at all. "It needs to be clean or infection will kill you just as surely as that bullet might have." She worked in silence for several minutes, cleaning and examining both sides of the wound before reaching for needle and thread. Frank watched her thread the needle with the same precision she probably used for her sewing work and braced himself for what came next. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "I figured as much." The first pull of the thread through his skin made him see stars, but Frank bit down on his tongue and forced himself to stay still. Hannah worked quickly, her stitches small and neat, like she was hemming a fine dress instead of sewing up a bullet hole. By the time she finished both sides of the wound and wrapped it in clean bandages, sweat was running down Frank's face and his head was spinning. "Drink this," Hannah said, pressing a cup of water into his good hand. He drained it gratefully, then accepted a second cup along with a slice of bread that appeared on the table before him. "Thank you," Frank said, his voice rough. "I don't have much money to pay you, but I'll work it off however I can." Hannah sat down across from him, studying his face with those sharp green eyes. "You can pay me by not getting yourself killed. That wound needs to stay clean and dry for at least a week, preferably 2. You'll need the bandages changed daily. Where are you staying?" Frank realized he didn't have a good answer. He'd planned to camp outside of town, save what little money he had for supplies. "I've got a bedroll. I'll be fine." "You absolutely will not be fine," Hannah said firmly. "You'll get dirt in that wound, it will get infected, and you'll die. There's a small room above the stable behind this house. It's not much, but it's clean and dry. You can stay there until that arm heals properly." "Madam, I couldn't impose like that. It's not an imposition if I'm offering. Besides, I'll need you close by to make sure you're changing those bandages properly and not doing something foolish." She stood and moved to the stove, ladling soup from a pot into a bowl. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" Frank couldn't remember. 2 days ago. 3. Time had a way of blurring together when you were riding from town to town looking for work. Hannah set the bowl in front of him without waiting for an answer, along with a spoon and more bread. "Eat," she commanded. "Then I'll show you to the room." The soup was the best thing Frank had tasted in months, thick with vegetables and tender pieces of chicken. He forced himself to eat slowly, though his stomach demanded he wolf it down. Hannah busied herself tidying the kitchen, but he could feel her watching him from the corner of her eye. "Why are you helping me?" Frank asked between spoonfuls. "You don't know me, I could be dangerous." Hannah turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "Are you dangerous?" "Not to women who show me kindness." "Then I suppose I'm safe enough." She dried her hands on her apron. "The truth is, Mr. Yates, I know what it's like to need help and have doors closed in your face. I know what it's like to be alone and desperate. If I can spare someone else that feeling, I will." There was a story there, Frank could tell, something painful lurking beneath the surface of her calm exterior. But he was too tired and too grateful to pry, so he simply finished his soup and followed her outside when she beckoned. The stable was small, just big enough for the single horse that occupied one of the 2 stalls. A mare, brown and placid, who barely looked up as they entered. A ladder led to a loft space above, where Hannah had apparently stored extra furniture and supplies. She helped him climb up, which was harder than it should have been with only one good arm, and showed him a space she'd cleared in the corner. "I'll bring you blankets and a pillow," she said. "There's a lantern here, but be careful with it. I'd rather not have my stable burned down." "Yes, madam." She paused at the ladder, looking back at him. "My name is Hannah. You don't have to keep calling me madam like I'm some old matron. I'm only 24. Frank managed a smile despite the throbbing in his arm. "Frank, though I suspect you already figured that out." I did. Rest now, Frank. I'll check on you in the morning. She descended the ladder and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Frank alone in the loft with more questions than answers. He settled onto the makeshift bed she'd prepared, his arm pulsing with pain despite her careful ministrations. Through the small window, he could see the lights of Petaluma twinkling in the distance, and beyond them, the dark silhouette of the mountains against the star-filled sky. Sleep came despite the pain, and with it, dreams of green eyes and gentle hands that knew how to mend broken things. Morning arrived with the sound of Hannah's mare nickering for breakfast and sunlight streaming through the loft window. Frank woke slowly, his arm stiff and aching but not as bad as he'd feared. He made his way carefully down the ladder, favoring his injured arm, and found Hannah already in the stable with a bucket of feed. "Good morning," she said, glancing up at him. "How's the arm? Hurts, but I've had worse." "I'll change the bandage after breakfast. Come inside and wash up." Frank followed her back to the house, where she had breakfast waiting on the table. Eggs and bacon, fresh bread, and coffee that smelled like heaven. He hadn't expected such hospitality, hadn't expected her to feed him again, and the generosity made something in his chest tighten. "You don't have to do all this," he said as she poured him coffee. "I know I don't have to, I want to." Hannah sat across from him with her own plate. "Besides, you need to keep your strength up if that arm is going to heal properly." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Hannah spoke again. "Tell me about yourself, Frank Yates. Where are you from?" "Texas, originally. Small town outside San Antonio. Left when I was 18 to see more of the world. Been working ranches and odd jobs ever since, moving from place to place." "No family," Frank shook his head. "My parents passed when I was young. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I was raised by my uncle, but he had his own family to worry about. When I came of age, I figured it was time to make my own way." "That must have been hard," Hannah said quietly. "Being alone so young. You get used to it. What about you? You said you had brothers." A shadow crossed Hannah's face, brief but unmistakable. "Had 3 younger brothers. They died 7 years ago along with my mother. There was a fire in our old house in Sacramento. I was out at the market. My father and I were the only ones who survived." Frank set down his fork, the food suddenly tasteless in his mouth. "I'm sorry, that's a terrible loss." "Yes." Hannah's voice was steady, but he could hear the old grief beneath it. "My father never really recovered. He threw himself into his work, started drinking. He died 3 years ago. Heart just gave out one day while he was working cattle at a ranch north of here. I sold everything and moved to Petaluma, wanted a fresh start somewhere nobody knew me or my family, and became a seamstress. My mother taught me before she died. It's honest work and it keeps me fed and housed. I have regular customers, enough to get by." She stood and began clearing the dishes. "But I imagine you don't want to hear my sad stories. Let me see that arm." Frank let her unwrap the bandages, watching her face as she examined the wound. Her expression was focused, professional, but he could see the lingering sadness in her eyes that her story had brought to the surface. The wound looked better than he'd expected. The bleeding stopped, and the edges already beginning to close. "It's healing well," Hannah said, cleaning it again with gentle efficiency. "No signs of infection. You were lucky. I had a good doctor." She rewrapped his arm with fresh bandages, her fingers brushing against his skin with a touch that was purely practical yet somehow intimate in its care. When she finished, she stepped back and wiped her hands on her apron. "I have work to do today. Mrs. Henderson is coming by for a fitting, and I have 3 dresses that need to be finished by the end of the week. You should rest, let that arm heal." "I'm not much for sitting idle," Frank said. "Is there anything I can do around here? One-handed work, maybe, seems only fair since you're housing and feeding me. Hannah considered this for a moment. The fence around the garden needs mending. Some of the posts are loose. Think you can manage that with one good arm? I can try. She showed him to the small garden behind the house, where vegetables were starting to push up through the soil in neat rows. The fence was simple split rail, and several of the posts were indeed wobbly. Hannah brought him tools and nails, then left him to work while she returned to her sewing. Frank spent the morning working slowly and carefully, bracing the posts with his body while he hammered with his good hand. It was awkward and took 3 times as long as it would have with 2 working arms, but he managed. The physical labor felt good, gave him something to focus on besides the ache in his injured arm, and the surprising comfort he'd found in this woman's unexpected kindness. When Hannah called him in for lunch, he'd managed to repair half the fence. She looked genuinely pleased as she served him cold chicken and fresh bread. "You didn't have to work so hard," she said. "I told you to rest. I needed to feel useful. Besides, it's the least I can do." Over lunch, they talked more easily than Frank had talked with anyone in years. Hannah asked about his travels, the places he'd seen, the work he'd done. He found himself telling her stories about sleeping under the stars in Arizona, about breaking horses in Nevada, about the time he'd helped drive cattle from Texas to Kansas and nearly lost his life in a stampede. In turn, Hannah spoke about her sewing work, about the women of Petaluma and their various peculiarities, about her small garden and her plans to expand it. She spoke about missing her brothers, about the small things that reminded her of them, about learning to live with grief that never quite went away. "You carry it with you," she said softly. "The loss, it becomes part of who you are. Some days it's lighter than others, but it's always there." Frank understood that. He'd been carrying his own losses for so long, he barely noticed the weight anymore. But talking with Hannah, he realized how lonely that carrying had been, how rarely he'd shared the burden with anyone else. The days fell into a pattern after that. Frank worked on small projects around Hannah's property during the day, things he could manage with one arm. He repaired the rest of the fence, fixed a loose board on the porch steps, cleaned out the stable and organized the loft space. Hannah changed his bandages every morning and evening, her touch becoming familiar, almost comforting in its routine. In the evenings, after Hannah finished her sewing work, they would sit on the porch and talk as the sun set. Frank learned that she loved reading but couldn't afford many books, so she borrowed them from the town library. He learned that she sang to herself while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, that she'd built a life for herself from nothing, that she'd survived losses that would have broken a weaker person. Hannah learned that Frank was 26 and had spent the last 8 years drifting from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. She learned that he was good with his hands, patient with animals, and could tell stories that made her laugh until her sides hurt. She learned that beneath his quiet exterior was a man who noticed things, who paid attention, who treated her with a respect and kindness she'd almost forgotten existed. 2 weeks after Frank had stumbled onto her porch bleeding and desperate, Hannah declared his wound healed enough that he could probably move on if he wanted to. The words came out stilted, awkward, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "You've been more than generous," Frank said carefully. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." "You haven't," Hannah said quickly. Then, quieter, "It's been nice having someone around. The house feels less empty." Frank turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw the loneliness in her eyes that matched his own. "I've been thinking about that ranch work up in Sonoma County. But I've also been thinking that Petaluma seems like a nice place to settle down, if there's work to be found here." "There might be," Hannah said, a small smile playing at her lips. "Old Mr. Peterson has been looking for someone to help with his horses. He's getting too old to break them himself, but he's too stubborn to retire. And the lumber mill is always hiring strong backs. I could look into that. If you think it would be all right." "All right." Frank took a breath, gathering courage. "I like it here, Hannah. I like this town. I like your cooking and your stories and the way you hum while you work. I like fixing things around your property and sitting on this porch in the evenings. I haven't felt settled anywhere in 8 years, but these past 2 weeks, I've felt something close to home." Hannah's cheeks colored in the fading light. "Oh, if I'm speaking out of turn, tell me and I'll ride out tomorrow morning. But if there's a chance, even a small one, that you might want me to stay, I'd like to try building something here. Something real and lasting." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the mountains in the distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been alone for so long, Frank. I've gotten used to it, built walls around myself to keep from getting hurt again. I told myself I was fine, that I didn't need anyone. I understand if you want to keep those walls up. I won't push." "That's not what I'm saying." Hannah turned to face him, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm saying those walls started crumbling the moment you showed up bleeding on my porch. I'm saying I haven't felt this alive, this awake in 7 years. I'm saying the thought of you leaving makes my chest hurt in a way I wasn't sure I could feel anymore." Frank reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his good one. Her fingers were calloused from needlework, strong and capable, and they curled around his like they belonged there. "Then I'll stay," he said, "for as long as you'll have me. What if that's a very long time? I'm counting on it." She laughed, a sound that was half sob, and Frank found himself smiling wider than he had in years. They sat there on the porch as full darkness fell, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge one by one across the California sky. The next morning, Frank rode into town on Hannah's mare to speak with Mr. Peterson about the horsework. The old rancher was indeed looking for help, and after watching Frank handle a particularly spirited gelding with calm patience despite his still healing arm, he offered a job on the spot. The pay was decent, enough to rent a room in town and pay for his meals, but Frank had other ideas. "If it's all right with you, sir, I'd like to take half wages for the first few months," Frank said. "I need to save up for some lumber and supplies. I'm planning to build something." Mr. Peterson, who was 60 if he was a day, with a white beard and sharp blue eyes, gave Frank a knowing look. "This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain seamstress who lives at the edge of town, would it? Word travels fast. In a town this size. You sneeze on one end of Main Street and someone on the other end says bless you." The old man grinned. "Hannah Langford is good people, lost too much too young, but she's made something of herself anyway. You planning to do right by her?" "I'm planning to spend every day trying to deserve her, sir." "Good answer. You're hired. Start Monday." Frank worked harder over the next 3 months than he'd ever worked in his life. He spent his days at Peterson's ranch, breaking horses and mending fences and learning the business from a man who'd been doing it for 40 years. He spent his evenings building an addition onto the back of Hannah's house, a proper bedroom with real windows and a door that closed, giving her more space than the single room she'd been living in. Hannah protested at first, said it was too much, but Frank was insistent. "You gave me a place to stay when I needed it most. Let me give you something back." She helped when she could, holding boards steady while he hammered, bringing him water and food when he forgot to stop for meals. They worked together as the summer heat gave way to autumn cool, And somewhere in those long evenings of shared labor, friendship deepened into something more. It was Hannah who made the first move. Frank was hammering the last board into place on the new room when she set down her water bucket and simply took his face in both her hands and kissed him. It was gentle and tentative, a question more than a demand, and Frank answered by wrapping his arms around her and pulling her close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Hannah laughed against his chest. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks." "Why didn't you?" "I was scared. What if you didn't feel the same way? What if I was reading everything wrong?" Frank tilted her chin up so she had to look at him. "Hannah Langford, I have been completely and thoroughly in love with you since the day you told me to take off my shirt and stop being foolish about my modesty. I was just trying to be respectful, give you time. Well, stop being so respectful and kiss me again." He did, and it was better than the first time, deeper and more confident, a promise of things to come. They stood there in the framework of the room Frank had built, holding each other as the sun set behind the mountains, and both felt something broken inside them begin to heal. Frank moved his things from the stable loft to the new room that same week, though he was careful to maintain propriety. They weren't married yet, after all, and he wouldn't risk Hannah's reputation for anything. But the small house felt more like a home with both of them in it, with Frank's boots by the door and his hat hanging on a peg next to Hannah's shawl. He proposed properly in December, on Christmas Eve, with a ring he'd saved 3 months to buy. Nothing fancy, just a simple gold band, but Hannah cried when he slipped it on her finger and said yes before he could even get the whole question out. They married in the spring of 1879, a year after Frank had stumbled onto Hannah's porch with a bullet in his arm. The ceremony was small, held in the town church with Mr. Peterson standing as Frank's best man and Mrs. Henderson grudgingly serving as Hannah's witness. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward, which surprised them both. "Told you," Mr. Peterson said with a wink. "Hannah's good people. Folks here are happy to see her happy." The first years of their marriage were the happiest Frank had ever known. He continued working for Mr. Peterson, learning everything the old man could teach him about horses and ranching. Hannah kept up her sewing work, her reputation for quality craftsmanship bringing in steady business. Together, they saved every penny they could, planning for a future they were building together. Frank noticed things about Hannah that first year, little things that spoke to the wounds she still carried. The way she would go quiet sometimes on the anniversary of the fire, retreating into herself no matter how hard he tried to reach her. The nightmares that woke her gasping in the middle of the night, dreams of flames and screaming that she could never quite escape. The way she would sometimes clutch his hand too tightly, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. He learned to tend those wounds with the same gentle care she'd shown his injured arm. When the dark days came, he didn't try to fix her or talk her out of her grief. He simply held her, let her cry, reminded her that she wasn't alone anymore. When the nightmares came, he woke her gently and talked to her about anything and everything until the fear faded and she could sleep again. "I'm broken," Hannah whispered one night after a particularly bad nightmare. "Too damaged to ever be whole again." Frank held her closer. "You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. How can you stand it? How can you stand me like this?" "Hannah, look at me." He waited until she met his eyes. "You saved my life the day we met, not just from that bullet wound, but from a life of wandering with no purpose and no home. You gave me something to build toward, something worth fighting for. If you have dark days, if you have nightmares, if you need to grieve, then I'll be right here beside you through all of it. That's what love is. That's what marriage is. The good days and the hard ones, all of it together." She clung to him and cried, but it was a different kind of crying than before. A release, a letting go, a step toward healing. In the summer of 1880, Mr. Peterson called Frank into his office with a serious expression. Frank braced himself for bad news, but instead, the old man pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "You've been working for me for 2 years now," Peterson said, pouring drinks. "Best hand I've ever had, and I've had plenty. You're smart, you work hard, and you know horses better than men half again your age. Thank you, sir. I'm getting old, Frank. My knees ache, my back hurts, and I'm tired. My son moved to San Francisco years ago and has no interest in ranching. I've been thinking about what comes next for this place." Frank waited, not sure where this was going. "I want to sell you the ranch. Not all of it. I'm not ready to give up the house and the land it sits on. But the business, the horses, the equipment, half the grazing land. Everything you'd need to run your own operation." Frank nearly dropped his glass. "Sir, I don't have that kind of money." "I know you don't. That's why I'm willing to work out terms. You pay me what you can now, then a percentage of your profits each year until the debt is paid. I trust you, Frank. I know you'll do right by it." It took Frank 3 days of discussing it with Hannah before they made the decision. It was a risk, a huge one, but it was also an opportunity they might never get again. Hannah's sewing income was steady, and Frank's wages had been good. They had some savings. With careful management and a lot of hard work, they could make it work. They accepted Mr. Peterson's offer in July, and by August, Frank was running his own horse ranch. The work was brutal, dawn to dusk and sometimes beyond, but it was his work, his business, his future. Hannah helped however she could, managing the books and the business side of things while still keeping up with her sewing. They were building something together, something that would last. Their first son was born in the spring of 1881, a healthy boy with Frank's dark hair and Hannah's green eyes. They named him Samuel, after Frank's father, and Frank had never known his heart could hold so much love and terror at the same time. He held his son in the hospital and looked at Hannah, exhausted but glowing with joy, and felt something shift inside him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For what? For giving me a family, for giving me a home, for being brave enough to let me love you." Hannah reached for his hand. "You gave me those things too, you know. You gave me a reason to open my heart again, to let myself feel joy instead of just surviving. You tended my wounded soul when I didn't even know it needed tending." Samuel grew from infant to toddler, filling the house with noise and laughter. The ranch prospered under Frank's careful management, gaining a reputation for quality horses throughout Sonoma and Marin counties. Hannah's sewing business grew as well, until she had more work than she could handle alone and began teaching other women in town her craft. In 1883, their daughter was born, a tiny thing with wisps of auburn hair and lungs that could wake the dead. They named her Margaret, after Hannah's mother, and watching Hannah hold their daughter, Frank saw the last of the old shadows finally leave his wife's eyes. The grief would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. Life fell into a rhythm of seasons and years. Spring births and summer grazing, autumn sales and winter planning. Children growing and learning, scraped knees mended and bedtime stories told. The ranch expanded as Frank paid down his debt to Mr. Peterson and saved enough to buy more land. They built a larger house, a real ranch house with multiple bedrooms and a proper parlor, though Hannah insisted on keeping her sewing room in the original structure. "That's where it all started," she said when Frank questioned why she didn't want a bigger workspace. "That's where you came into my life. I'm not giving that up." There were hard times too. A bad winter in 1885 that killed half their stock and nearly bankrupted them. A drought in 1887 that dried up the creek and forced them to haul water from town. The normal struggles of raising children and running a business and trying to be good partners to each other. Through it all, Frank remembered what he'd promised himself that first night in Hannah's stable loft. He'd promised to spend his life deserving her kindness, tending her wounded soul the way she'd tended his wounded arm. When Hannah had dark days, when the memories of her lost family threatened to overwhelm her, he was there. When she doubted herself or her choices, he reminded her of her strength. When she needed to talk or needed silence, he gave her whatever she needed, and Hannah did the same for him. When Frank's old restlessness threatened to surface, when he felt the pull of the open road and the temptation to run, she anchored him with her love and her faith in him. When he doubted his abilities as a father or a rancher, she reminded him of how far they'd come. When he needed her, she was there, steady and sure and strong. Samuel turned out to have his father's way with horses, spending every spare moment in the stables from the time he could walk. By the time he was 10, he could break a green horse as well as men twice his age. Margaret inherited her mother's skill with needle and thread, but also showed a sharp head for business that surprised them both. In 1890, Mr. Peterson passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73. Frank and Hannah attended the funeral, their children beside them, and Frank felt the weight of gratitude for the old man who'd given him his chance. Peterson left his house and remaining land to a distant nephew, but Frank didn't mind. He had everything he needed. Their third child, a boy they named Joseph, was born in 1891 when Hannah was 37 and Frank was 39. The pregnancy was harder than the previous two, and Frank spent those 9 months terrified he might lose her. But Hannah was as strong as ever, delivering a healthy baby boy who looked exactly like his older brother. "No more," Frank said, holding her hand after the birth. "I can't watch you go through that again." Hannah laughed weakly. "Don't worry, 3 is plenty, our family is complete." And it was. The Yates Ranch became one of the most successful in Sonoma County, known for quality horses and fair dealing. Hannah's sewing business evolved into a teaching enterprise, with young women coming from all over the region to learn her techniques. Samuel grew into a fine young man who took over more and more of the ranch work. Margaret showed promise as a businesswoman. Joseph was still young, but showed signs of inheriting both his parents' best qualities. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, Frank and Hannah sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over land they owned and had worked with their own hands. Their children were inside, arguing good-naturedly over a card game. Somewhere in the distance, horses nickered in their stables. "You ever think about that day?" Hannah asked. "When you showed up bleeding on my porch?" "Every day," Frank said. "Best piece of bad luck I ever had." "I think about it too, how close I came to not answering the door. I heard the knock and almost ignored it, almost decided whoever it was could come back another day." Frank took her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of 20 years of practice. "But you didn't." "No." "Something made me answer. Maybe fate, maybe God, maybe just chance. But I answered, and you were there, and everything changed. I was just a drifter with a bullet hole in my arm. You were exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know it. You gave me a reason to live again instead of just existing. You showed me that letting someone in didn't mean losing them, that love could heal instead of hurt." Frank pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder the way she had 1,000 times before. "You saved my life that day, Hannah, and then you saved my soul every day after." "We saved each other," she said softly. "That's what love does. It sees the broken places and helps make them whole again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of partnership, 20 years of tending each other's wounds and building a life together. It hadn't always been easy, but it had always been worth it. Inside, they heard Margaret calling them for supper, and they rose together to join their children. As they walked inside, Frank caught Hannah's hand and pulled her back for just a moment. "I love you," he said. "Now and always." "I love you too," Hannah replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. "My grateful cowboy." Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of a life well lived. Samuel married in 1901, bringing home a sweet-natured girl named Catherine from Sacramento. They built a house on the eastern edge of the ranch property and started their own family, giving Frank and Hannah their first grandchildren. Twins, a boy and a girl, born in the spring of 1902. Margaret married a banker from San Francisco in 1903, scandalizing some of the town by choosing city life over ranch life. But she was happy, and that was all that mattered to Frank and Hannah. She visited often, bringing her husband, who gradually learned to appreciate the slower pace of Petaluma. Joseph showed no interest in settling down, content to work the ranch alongside his father and brother. He had his father's wandering spirit but also his mother's deep roots, satisfied to explore the world through books and stories rather than actually leaving the land he loved. Hannah's hair turned silver and Frank's dark locks went gray. Their hands became weathered with age, their movements slower, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it deepened, aged like fine wine, becoming richer and more complex with every passing year. In 1905, they celebrated their 26th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. The ranch house was full of noise and laughter, exactly as they'd always dreamed it would be. After everyone had gone to bed, Frank and Hannah walked out to the original house, the one where it had all begun. Hannah's sewing room was still there, though she didn't work as much these days. Arthritis had made the delicate stitching difficult. But the room remained, a testament to the life she'd built before Frank, the strength she'd shown in surviving her losses and making something of herself. "You remember the first time I changed your bandages?" Hannah asked, running her hand along the old kitchen table where Frank had sat bleeding all those years ago. "I remember thinking you were bossy and terrifying," Frank said with a smile, "and beautiful. Even through the pain, I noticed that." "I was terrified," Hannah admitted. "You were a stranger, bleeding in my kitchen, and all I could think was that I couldn't let another person die if I had the power to help them. I'd lost so many people. I couldn't bear to lose another, even a stranger." "I wasn't a stranger for long." "No, you weren't." She turned to face him. "You became my home, Frank. My safe place. The person I could be broken with and know you wouldn't leave." Frank crossed the room and took her in his arms, holding her the way he had countless times over the years. "You healed me, Hannah. Not just my arm, but all the lonely, hurting parts of me I didn't even know were wounded. You showed me what it meant to have a home, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving day to day." "We healed each other," Hannah said, echoing words she'd spoken years before. "That's what we've always done." They stood there in the old kitchen, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a love that had weathered every storm. Outside, the California night was quiet except for the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. The years after 1905 were gentle ones. Frank gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Samuel, though he still spent his days working with the horses he loved. Hannah taught her granddaughters to sew, passing on the skills her own mother had taught her so many years ago. They took long walks in the evenings, visited with friends in town, played with their growing number of grandchildren. Frank turned 60 in 1914, a milestone he'd never imagined reaching during his wandering years. Hannah threw him a party that filled the ranch house to bursting, with people coming from all over the county to celebrate. Looking around at the crowd, at the life they'd built together, Frank felt a contentment so deep it almost frightened him. "What are you thinking?" Hannah asked, finding him alone on the porch for a moment of quiet. "That I almost missed all of this. If that card cheat had been a better shot, if I'd stumbled into someone else's house, if you'd turned me away. I almost missed this entire beautiful life." Hannah took his hand. "But you didn't. You found your way to my door, and I found the courage to open it. Everything else followed from that moment. Best decision I ever made, bleeding on your porch." She laughed, the sound as bright and clear as it had been 26 years ago. "Best decision I ever made, not letting you bleed to death in my kitchen." In 1918, the Spanish flu swept through California like wildfire, claiming lives without mercy or pattern. The Yates family mostly escaped it, though Joseph fell ill for a terrifying 2 weeks before finally recovering. Frank and Hannah nursed him themselves, refusing to leave his bedside, and when he finally turned the corner toward health, they held each other and wept with relief. "I couldn't have borne it," Hannah said. "Not another loss, not one of our children." "I know," Frank said, understanding completely. The scars from her early losses had faded but never fully disappeared. The thought of losing one of their children still terrified her in a way that nothing else could, but they didn't lose him. Joseph recovered fully and went back to work on the ranch, and life continued its steady march forward. By 1920, Frank and Hannah were 66 and 66 respectively, still sharp in mind if slower in body. They sat on their porch most evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. Their children were grown and settled, their grandchildren were thriving, and they'd built something that would last beyond their own lifetimes. "You have any regrets?" Hannah asked one evening as they rocked in their matching chairs. Frank considered the question seriously. "Only that I didn't find you sooner, that we didn't get more years together. We've had over 40 years. That's more than many people get. It's not enough. A lifetime wouldn't be enough with you." Hannah reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. "We've had a good life, Frank. A really good life. We found each other, we built something beautiful together, we raised good children who are raising good children of their own. We turned our pain into something positive. Not everyone can say that." "No," Frank agreed. "Not everyone can." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the familiar sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear Samuel calling to the horses, hear the laughter of grandchildren playing. The ranch was alive and thriving, a legacy they'd built from nothing but hard work and love. Frank thought back to that desperate young man who'd stumbled onto a stranger's porch with a bullet in his arm, bleeding and alone and afraid. He thought about how easily he could have died that day, how close he'd come to never knowing this life, this love, this profound sense of belonging. And he thought about Hannah, the young woman who'd lost everything but found the strength to keep going, to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. She could have turned him away, could have kept her door and her heart closed to protect herself from more pain. But she hadn't. She'd chosen courage over fear, compassion over caution, and in doing so, had saved them both. The years moved forward with increasing speed, each one feeling shorter than the last. Samuel and Catherine had 5 children total, all of them showing aptitude for ranch work or business. Margaret had 3 children, city kids who nonetheless loved visiting their grandparents' ranch. Joseph eventually married in his late 40s, bringing home a widow with 2 children of her own, and they settled into a happy blended family. Frank and Hannah's golden years were truly golden. They were surrounded by love and family, respected in their community, comfortable in their home. They'd weathered every storm together and come out stronger for it. In the spring of 1925, They celebrated their 46th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them. Their children had offered to host a party, but Frank and Hannah preferred the intimacy of each other's company. 46 years, Hannah marveled, looking at Frank across the table. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together. I know exactly what you mean, Frank said. The days are long, but the years are short. Do you remember what you promised me, all those years ago, that you'd spend your life trying to deserve my kindness? I remember. You've more than kept that promise, Frank Yates. You've given me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You've loved me through my darkest days and my brightest ones. You've tended my wounded soul with more care and patience than I ever thought possible. Frank felt tears prick his eyes. It was never a burden, Hannah. It was a privilege. Loving you has been the greatest honor of my life. They finished their dinner and retired to the porch, as was their habit. The evening was cool and clear, perfect California spring weather. They sat close together, Hannah's head on Frank's shoulder, watching the stars emerge one by one. I used to be so afraid, Hannah said softly. After the fire, after I lost my family, I was afraid to love anyone again, afraid to open my heart because I knew how badly it could hurt to lose someone. What changed? You did. You showed me that love was worth the risk. That closing myself off meant missing out on all the beauty and joy that life had to offer. You taught me to be brave again. Frank kissed the top of her head. You taught me what it meant to have a home, what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself. Before you, I was just drifting through life with no real purpose. You gave me purpose. They sat quietly for a while, wrapped in the comfort of each other's presence and the memories of 46 years together. The night sounds of the ranch surrounded them, familiar and soothing. Frank. Hannah said eventually, yes. If you had it to do all over again, knowing everything that would happen, all the hard times and struggles, would you still knock on my door? Frank didn't hesitate. In a heartbeat. I'd knock on your door in every lifetime, Hannah. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. You're the best thing that ever happened to me too, Hannah whispered. My grateful cowboy who stayed. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Summer heat gave way to autumn cool, winter rains yielded to spring blooms. Frank and Hannah grew older together, their steps slower, their joints stiffer, but their love as strong as ever. In 1928, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a massive party that brought people from all over the state. The ranch house couldn't hold everyone, so they set up tables outside, and the celebration lasted well into the night. Frank and Hannah stood together, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, and marveled at everything they'd built together. 50 years, Frank said, looking at Hannah in the lamplight. She was 74 now, her face lined with age, her hair pure white, but to him she was still the beautiful woman who'd tended his wounds and captured his heart. 50 years, Hannah echoed, and I'd do it all again. They danced that night, slowly and carefully, but they danced. Their children and grandchildren watched with wet eyes as the elderly couple swayed together, lost in their own world, celebrating a love that had endured 5 decades. Frank and Hannah lived to see the 1930s arrive, watched the world change in ways they'd never imagined. Automobiles became common, radio brought news and entertainment into homes, the whole pace of life seemed to accelerate. But on their ranch in Petaluma, time still moved at its own steady pace. They spent their final years doing simple things together. Sitting on the porch, taking slow walks around the property, playing with their great-grandchildren, telling stories about the old days. They'd lived long, full lives, and they faced the approaching end with the same courage they'd faced everything else. Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1932, at the age of 80. He went to bed beside Hannah as he had for 53 years, kissed her good night as always, and simply didn't wake up. Hannah found him in the morning still peaceful, and though her heart broke, she was grateful he'd gone without pain or suffering. The funeral was enormous, with people coming from all over California to pay their respects to the man who'd built one of the most successful ranches in the region, who'd raised good children and lived an honorable life. But to Hannah, he was simply Frank, the grateful cowboy who'd stumbled onto her porch with a wounded arm and stayed to tend her wounded soul. Hannah lived 2 more years after Frank's death, though part of her had died with him. She spent those years with her children and grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom, making sure the next generations knew the love story that had founded their family. She passed away in the spring of 1934, in the same house where she'd first tended Frank's wounds 56 years earlier. Her children had wanted to move her to the main ranch house, but she'd insisted on staying in the original structure, the place where everything had begun. On her final day, surrounded by her children, Hannah looked around the simple room with a smile. "This is where I saved his life," she said softly, "and where he saved mine. This is where we became us." Samuel held her hand. "Tell us again, Mama. Tell us how you and Papa met." So Hannah told the story one last time, about a desperate cowboy with a bullet wound and a lonely seamstress who'd lost everything. About kindness given and returned, about wounds that healed and love that grew, about 2 broken people who'd found wholeness in each other. "He was grateful for the rest of his life," Hannah said, her voice growing weaker. "Always said I saved him, but the truth is we saved each other. That's what real love does. It tends the wounds you can't heal on your own." Those were her last words. She closed her eyes and slipped away peacefully, a smile on her face, joining the man she'd loved for over half a century. They buried Hannah next to Frank on a hillside overlooking the ranch they'd built together. The entire town of Petaluma turned out for the funeral, along with people from all over California who'd known and respected the Yates family. Years later, when Samuel was old himself, he would bring his grandchildren to that hillside and tell them the story of their great-grandparents. About a chance meeting that changed 2 lives. About love that healed old wounds and built something beautiful. About the grateful cowboy who'd spent a lifetime tending the wounded soul of the woman who'd saved him. The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management and later his children's, remaining in the family for generations. The original house where Frank and Hannah had met was preserved exactly as it had been, a monument to where it all began. And every year on the anniversary of their wedding, the family would gather there to remember the love story that had started it all. Because that's what Frank and Hannah had given them, not just land or legacy, but an example of what love could be. Patient and kind, enduring and strong, capable of healing the deepest wounds and building something that lasted beyond a single lifetime. They'd both come to that first meeting broken in their own ways, Frank with his physical wound and rootless life, Hannah with her grief and fear of loving again. And through choosing each other, through tending each other's wounds with patience and care, they'd both become whole. The grateful cowboy had indeed spent his lifetime tending her wounded soul, but she'd spent that same lifetime tending his. They'd saved each other, healed each other, loved each other through 53 years of marriage and every day beyond in memory. Their story became legend in Petaluma, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments, a bullet wound, a desperate stumble to a stranger's door, can lead to the best things life has to offer. That kindness shown to a stranger can change the course of 2 lives. That love, real love, has the power to heal wounds that seem unhealable. The ranch stood for over 100 years, a testament to what Frank and Hannah had built. And every spring, when the California hills turned green and wildflowers bloomed across the grazing land, people said you could almost see them there, a dark-haired cowboy and an auburn-haired seamstress, walking hand in hand across the land they'd loved, still together, still whole, still tending each other's hearts the way they had from that very first day.